Shalina, thanks for joining me today. Let's start with some background, if you don't mind. What is this franchise deal?
Sure. So for a little history, you might have wondered why SDG&E is our main service provider here. Well, 50 years ago, the city of San Diego and San Diego Gas and Electric signed a contract, and that contract gave SDG&E something called right of way. Essentially, it gives the utility the right to rip up the streets and do whatever they need to provide service, and provide service in a monopoly. That's called a franchise agreement. Back then, SDG&E paid only $50,000 for it, and of course a yearly tax. But anyway, now that contract will expire in January, and the city is trying to figure out how to do another one of these. It's essentially putting up the chance to service the city in a type of auction, and utilities can bid for this chance. The city right now is asking for a minimum bid of $62 million for a 20-year contract.
And in your feature, you report that community advocates say utilities should be required to pay more than $62 million.
Yeah, the reason why is because this franchise is estimated on the low end to give a utility about $6.4 billion in profits over 20 years. Advocates say that's a ton of money that's coming from San Diego residents. And so residents should get that money back. SDG&E is, of course, bidding again for the franchise deal. Two other companies said they're also interested, but advocates point to SDG&E's profits. So if you look at SEC filings, the utilities' profits have doubled in the last decade, from around $360 million to over $700 million in profit last year. That's really good for a utility. And SDG&E charges some of the highest rates in the state. You can see that on this graph over here. Look at SDG&E compared to other utilities like PG&E and Southern California Edison. So community advocates say, hey, don't give away the right of way to the city for pennies. Here's one of those advocates, Matthew Vasilakis of the group Climate Action Campaign.
This deal is one of the largest real estate transactions that the city is going to have in decades. And I mean, this is the first time in 50 years that we get to renegotiate this deal. And we really need to make sure that it's community centered and community focused. And unfortunately, right now, the mayor's plan is not. It is a sweetheart deal for SDG&E.
Matthew Vasilakis says, hey, here's an opportunity for the city to get a nice chunk of change that could go toward the community at a time when the city is already facing a budget crisis due to the coronavirus pandemic. And the community needs this money to help with things like climate change, rising sea levels, and addressing systemic racism. But SDG&E says it doesn't even want to pay the $62 million. Remember, the utility is on track to earn potentially $1 billion in profits this year. Here's my interview with SDG&E executive Mitch Mitchell. So community and ratepayer advocates say based on these profits, SDG&E could easily pay more in franchise fees. What is your response to that?
My response is that we are not opposed to paying a reasonable franchise fee. We paid $50,000 in 1970. If you do the calculation of time, value, inflation, and money, a reasonable fee is somewhere in the $1.5 million to $2 million range, and we think that's appropriate.
Wow, that's really interesting. So tell us, what does the city say?
Sure. So I asked Deputy Chief Operating Officer Eric Caldwell about this and why the city isn't asking for more.
If we set that number too high, it discourages competition. If we set it too low, it potentially sets the ability for the city to receive far less revenue in an upfront payment than we believe is reasonable.
So Caldwell says the idea here is to set a reasonable bid to encourage competition and other utilities to bid. But I also spoke to Loretta Lynch. She's a former president for the California Public Utilities Commission and now works for an environmental advocacy group. She says being reasonable isn't really an issue because cities have lots of power.
Basing what is a good deal on what happened in 1970 really shortchanges every single resident of San Diego and every single business. If you got a penny for your golden goose 50 years ago, getting 2 pennies today is not a good deal if the goose is worth $2 billion.
Lynch says there's a lot of franchise agreements across the country, and now a lot of cities are figuring out how to approach them differently. For example, Salt Lake City didn't want to sign a decades-long agreement with their utility in 2008, so they signed a 5-year one. Lynch says San Diego doesn't have to follow what it did in the past. In fact, community advocates say they would rather have a 5-year agreement with the utility as well.
So Shalina, apparently there's another option that's on the table, and that's called municipalization. Tell us about that.
Sure. So instead of having another utility coming in and operating our gas and electric services, municipalization is the idea that the city would buy up all of this electric grid and essentially run the grid themselves. Right now, county leaders say that's not really an option, so they're looking more towards having another utility come in the bidding process.
So where are we at this deal right now? What can you tell us is coming next?
So on July 16th, the Environment Committee voted 3-1 to move forward with a consultant's report that lists that $62 million minimum bid recommendation. But a lot of community advocates feel like the vote happened really fast. And so does Council member Barbara Bree, who's running for mayor. She was the only one on the committee who voted no.
This is a very rushed process on what is one of the most important decisions facing the city.
Bree says some of the reports were only released to the public a week before the meeting, and that's not really fair. The chair of the Environment Committee, however, Jen Campbell, says they were reviewing the reports for weeks.
And let's move forward. You could speculate all day, but why? The good thing is to get it moving, get the bids in, see what they offer, and see what happens.
But now a local law firm has now threatened the city with a lawsuit to void the vote, saying the city violated open meeting laws for allegedly not meeting on the deal in public, which the public is entitled to hear about. So Maya, the answer to your question is TBD. It's unclear yet whether the lawsuit is going to hit the city and whether the vote will be voided, or perhaps that won't happen and the vote will go to full city council in the coming weeks.
Shalina, thank you so much for that report, and we'll be following along with you. I've been speaking with KPBS Science and Technology reporter Shalina Chatlani. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Maya.